The Montana wilderness had always held a special kind of magic for Mark Thompson. Every morning, as he stepped outside his small cabin, he was greeted by the crisp mountain air, the scent of pine, and the distant murmur of a river carving its way through the valley below. It was a life of solitude, but not loneliness. The forest had its own rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed through the land. And Mark had spent 15 years learning to move in sync with it. As a seasoned wildlife ranger, he had seen the best and worst of nature, breathtaking dawns over mist-covered valleys and the harsh reality of survival where only the strongest endured. He had witnessed wolves in their primal hunts, eagles soaring with the grace of ancient warriors, and the silent stalking of mountain lions through the underbrush. But of all the creatures that roamed these woods, it was the bears that commanded the most respect. Spring had arrived, bringing with it the great awakening of the wild. Bears, having spent the long winter in hibernation, were emerging from their dens, their powerful bodies lean and hungry. This was the most dangerous time of year for human encounters. A bear mother, fiercely protective of her cubs, would not hesitate to defend them with her life. Every ranger was taught one unshakable rule: never, under any circumstances, get between a mother bear and her cub. Mark had spent years documenting bear behavior, carefully keeping his distance, observing from behind the lens of his camera. His cabin walls bore the evidence: photographs of grizzlies wading through rivers, black bears shaking rain from their thick coats, cubs playfully tumbling over logs under their mother's watchful gaze. He admired these creatures from afar, never daring to intrude on their world. But on that particular morning, something changed. It began with a sound, distant, yet sharp enough to cut through the rustling of the wind. Mark froze mid-step, his instincts flaring to life. He had heard many sounds in these woods, but this was different. A cry. It was faint, but filled with unmistakable distress. Mark's heartbeat quickened as he scanned the area, trying to pinpoint the source. He adjusted the strap of his ranger pack, his boots crunching against the undergrowth as he moved toward the sound. The cries grew louder as he neared a clearing near the marshland, a place where the spring thaw had transformed the earth into a treacherous mix of mud and tangled roots. And then he saw it. A small bear cub, no older than a few months, struggling desperately in the thick mud. The cub's black fur was streaked with dirt, its tiny paws flailing, trying to gain traction but failing. Every attempt to free itself only drove it deeper into the earth. The mud had a grip like quicksand, swallowing its limbs inch by inch. Mark's breath caught. He had seen animals trapped in mud before: deer, elk, even wolves. But a bear cub? This was different. His first thought was of the mother. His sharp eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of her. Fresh bear tracks circled the mud pit, huge, deep imprints that told a heartbreaking story. She had been here. She had tried to reach her cub. And then she had left. But why? Mark crouched behind a fallen log, keeping his body low. His years of experience told him this was a dangerous situation. The cub's cries would not go unanswered for long. If the mother returned and found him anywhere near her baby, there would be no reasoning, no escape. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. This was nature's way, wasn't it? The strong survived. The weak perished. But then he met the cub's eyes, wide, pleading, filled with an innocence that knew nothing of the harsh rules of the wild. It was exhausted, its tiny body trembling from the effort of struggling for so long. Its cries had become weaker, the sound fading into helpless whimpers. Mark exhaled slowly. He had always believed in respecting nature's course, but standing there, watching that cub fight for its life, he realized something. Sometimes, nature needed a helping hand. Sometimes, survival wasn't just about instinct, it was about compassion. And in that moment, Mark made his decision. Slowly, he reached for the coiled rope in his pack. He was going in. Mark stood at the edge of the mud pit, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The cub's cries had weakened to mere whimpers, and time was running out. He knew he had to act fast. Every second that passed meant the little bear was closer to exhaustion, closer to sinking further into the muck where it would eventually suffocate. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him. He had been trained to let nature take its course, to observe but not interfere. But some moments demanded action. This was one of them. Mark took a deep breath, adjusting the coiled rope slung over his shoulder. The first step was to assess the ground. He tested it with his boot, pressing firmly. Some areas looked solid but gave way under pressure. The mud was deceptive. It wasn't just shallow sludge, it had layers of suction beneath, a trap waiting to pull anything under. He needed to be strategic. Pulling out a long branch. He tested the ground ahead, poking at the surface until he found a more stable path. The cub watched him with wide, tired eyes, barely able to lift its head. Mark could see its chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Its small paws still twitching in weak attempts to free itself. "All right, little one," he murmured, more to himself than to the cub. "Let's get you out of here." He tied the rope securely around his waist and looped the other end around the thick trunk of a nearby tree. If he got stuck, at least he had a way to pull himself out. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly with each movement. The mud grabbed at him, trying to pull him in. He could feel the weight of it around his calves, thick and unrelenting. Every step was a battle. 15 feet away. 10 feet. The cub stirred weakly, its ears twitching. Mark could see its tiny claws trying to grip the air. As if reaching for something, anything, to save itself. 5 feet. Almost there. Then his right foot sank deeper than expected. A sharp jolt of panic shot through him as the mud swallowed his leg up to the knee. The sudden pull throwing him off balance. His body lurched forward, and instinctively, he reached out, grabbing onto the long branch he had been using for support. His heart pounded. If he fell completely, this rescue would turn into a second disaster. Breathing deeply, Mark steadied himself, redistributing his weight. He gritted his teeth and pulled his leg free. The suction fighting him before finally releasing its grip. He was closer now. Close enough to see the cub's muddy fur, its small frame trembling. It barely had the strength to react to his presence anymore. Mark reached for the rope in his pack. He needed to get it around the cub before attempting to lift it. But as he moved, the cub let out a sudden, sharp cry, louder than before. The forest went silent. Every instinct in Mark's body screamed a warning. The mother was near. He froze, his body tense, listening. And then he heard it. A low, guttural growl. The deep rumble of something massive moving through the underbrush. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he turned his head slightly, just enough to see through the trees. A shadow moved between the pines. Then, stepping into the clearing, the mother bear emerged. She was enormous, her thick black fur bristling as she took in the scene before her. Mud clung to her paws, proof that she had tried and failed to reach her cub earlier. Her deep brown eyes locked onto Mark's figure, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. Mark felt his stomach tighten. This was it. There was no escaping quickly, not in this mud. He was trapped, exposed, and completely at the mercy of an animal capable of tearing him apart in seconds. The mother bear took a step forward, her muscles tense, her claws digging into the earth. She let out a warning huff, a sound that sent a clear message: "You are too close." Mark slowly raised his hands, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. His mind raced. Running wasn't an option. Trying to fight would be suicide. The only thing he could do was stay still and hope that the bear would recognize his intentions. The cub let out another weak cry. The mother's attention snapped back to her baby, her ears twitching as she processed the situation. Her massive head swung between Mark and the trapped cub, her breath coming in deep, heavy snorts. Mark barely dared to breathe. Then something incredible happened. The mother bear stepped closer, not toward him, but toward the mud pit. She circled it slowly, sniffing the ground, inspecting the area. She wasn't attacking. She was watching. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he realized the truth. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to see what he was doing. And she was waiting. Somehow, against all natural instincts, the mother bear was trusting him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. All right. No sudden moves. Carefully, keeping his eyes on the mother. He reached for the rope again. He slowly looped it around the cub's tiny body, making sure it was secure. The cub whimpered softly, too exhausted to resist. Mark took a deep breath. Now came the hard part. Bracing himself, he pulled gently on the rope, testing its hold. The cub barely had the strength to help, but little by little, it began to rise out of the mud. The mother bear let out a deep, low sound, not quite a growl, but something else. Encouragement? Mark didn't know. But he kept pulling. The mud fought him every step of the way. But inch by inch, the cub began to emerge. Its front paws found slightly firmer ground, and with one final tug, Mark lifted it free. The moment its tiny body hit solid earth, the cub let out a weak, relieved squeal. The mother bear moved immediately. Mark barely had time to react before she was there, her massive form looming over them. His breath hitched. Was this it? But instead of attacking, she nudged the cub gently with her nose, making soft, rumbling sounds deep in her throat. The cub responded with a weak, happy grunt, pressing itself against her warm fur. Mark felt his chest tighten. She was checking if her baby was okay. Then, as if satisfied, the mother bear did something Mark never could have anticipated. She turned back to him. For a long moment, their eyes met. Mark stood frozen, staring into the deep brown eyes of a creature that should have seen him as a threat, as an intruder. Instead, there was something else there, something ancient. Something primal. Understanding. Gratitude. Then, without another sound, she scooped her cub up by the scruff and carried it toward the trees. Mark exhaled, his body trembling. He had just witnessed something no ranger had ever experienced before. A mother bear had trusted a human to save her cub. And against every instinct, she had let him. As she disappeared into the dense forest, her cub safely nestled in her grasp, Mark stood there, his heart pounding, his body covered in sweat and mud. The forest fell silent once more. And he knew, his life would never be the same again. The forest remained still long after the mother bear and her cub had disappeared into the trees. Mark stood frozen in place, his body trembling from both exhaustion and the weight of what had just happened. His mind raced, trying to process the reality of what he had just experienced. A wild bear, a mother, no less, had not only allowed him to save her cub but had actively chosen not to attack him. That single moment had defied every natural law he had ever learned. He finally forced himself to move, his legs sluggish from being trapped in the mud. His body ached from the tension of the last few minutes, or had it been hours? It was hard to tell. He trudged back to solid ground, untying the rope from the tree that had anchored him. His boots left deep imprints in the mud as he retraced his steps, but his mind remained locked on the image of the mother bear's deep brown eyes staring into his. She had looked at him not with rage or fear, but with something deeper. Something that felt almost human. A visitor in the night. Mark returned to his cabin just before sunset, his muscles screaming in protest as he pushed open the wooden door. The familiar scent of pine and smoke greeted him, but it did little to ground his swirling thoughts. Slumping into his worn-out chair, he reached for his radio and pressed the button. "This is Ranger Mark Evans, checking in," he said, his voice rough from the day's events. The radio crackled before a voice responded. "Copy that, Mark. Everything all right?" He hesitated. "Yeah, just a long day." How could he possibly explain what had happened? He wasn't sure anyone would believe him. As darkness settled over the wilderness, Mark stared out the window, his mind replaying the events over and over. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Then, just past midnight, something stirred outside. A faint rustling in the trees. Mark sat up, his instincts kicking in. He moved quietly toward the door, his hand hovering near the flashlight clipped to his belt. A shadow shifted near the tree lean. His breath caught in his throat. It was her. The mother bear stood just beyond the reach of the cabin's dim porch light, her massive form barely visible in the darkness. Her cub was beside her, nestled against her legs, looking small against her towering figure. Mark's heart pounded. What was she doing here? She wasn't acting aggressive. She wasn't even moving toward the cabin. She was just watching. For several long moments, neither of them moved. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the mother bear lowered her head slightly, just for a moment, before turning away. She nudged her cub gently and disappeared back into the forest. Mark exhaled shakily, gripping the doorframe for support. She had come back. But why? Was it curiosity? Or was it something more? The offer of peace. The following morning, Mark woke up feeling as though he had dreamed the entire encounter. But when he stepped outside, his breath caught in his throat. Just a few feet from his porch, lying carefully atop a flat rock, was something that hadn't been there before. Berries. Fresh, plump berries, gathered and placed with deliberate care. Mark knelt down, examining them. They hadn't simply fallen from a tree. They had been brought here. By her. The mother bear had left him a gift. A thank you. Mark ran a hand through his hair, trying to comprehend the reality of what he was seeing. Bears didn't do this. They weren't capable of gratitude, or at least, that's what he had always believed. And yet, here it was. Undeniable proof that something profound had happened between them. Mark didn't take the berries. Instead, he simply sat beside them for a moment, absorbing the weight of what this meant. She remembered. She understood. And in the only way she could. She had given him something in return. A connection that would not fade. In the days that followed, Mark found himself scanning the tree line more often, searching for any sign of the bear and her cub. And on more than one occasion, he spotted them, sometimes at a distance, sometimes closer. She never approached, and neither did he. But the quiet understanding between them remained. Each week, fresh berries would appear on the same flat rock. Mark never took them, but he always acknowledged them, sometimes by leaving a small stone in their place, an unspoken exchange between man and beast. As weeks turned into months, the cub grew stronger, more confident. Mark often spotted it tumbling through the underbrush, its playful energy a stark contrast to the day he had first found it struggling in the mud. And though the mother bear remained protective, she no longer looked at Mark as a threat. She looked at him as something else. A guardian? A friend? Perhaps something even deeper. Mark had spent his entire career believing that the wild operated on instinct alone. That animals did not think beyond survival, that emotions were exclusive to humans. But the mother bear had proven him wrong. She had trusted him. And in doing so, she had changed everything he thought he knew. Months passed, and with each passing day, the bond between Mark and the mother bear deepened in ways he could never have imagined. The once tiny cub had grown stronger, its playful energy becoming more apparent as it tumbled through the underbrush or chased after falling leaves. The mother bear, ever watchful, continued to keep a close eye on her cub, ensuring it remained safe from predators. But something remarkable had happened. She no longer viewed Mark as a threat. Instead, she regarded him with something that defied logic, something that felt eerily like trust. A visitor like no other. One crisp autumn morning, Mark awoke to the sound of rustling outside his cabin. It was not the usual chirping of birds or the distant howl of wolves. This was different. As he stepped onto his porch, his breath hitched. The mother bear was back. But this time, she was closer than ever. She stood near the clearing, her cub by her side, gazing at Mark with calm, intelligent eyes. It was the first time she had willingly approached so near to his home. Mark didn't move. He knew better than to startle her. Instead, he did the only thing he could, he acknowledged her. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered himself onto the wooden steps of his porch and sat, watching her in quiet reverence. The mother bear remained still, her powerful frame silhouetted against the morning light. And then, in a moment that sent chills down Mark's spine, she lowered her head slightly, the same gesture she had given him after the rescue. A silent greeting. A show of respect. Mark felt his chest tighten. This was more than just an animal responding to survival instincts. This was something else. Something deeper. She remembered. She understood. And she had come back, not out of fear, but out of choice. The cub's growth and playfulness. As winter approached, the cub's confidence had grown immensely. Mark often spotted it wrestling with branches, rolling in the snow, or playfully nipping at its mother's fur. It was thriving, all thanks to the remarkable trust that had formed between its mother and a human. Mark couldn't help but smile as he watched the little bear chase after a fluttering leaf one evening. Its energy was boundless, its curiosity insatiable. And yet, despite its playfulness, it always remained close to its mother. She had taught it well. One afternoon, while on patrol, Mark noticed something fascinating. The cub, now much larger than when he had first rescued it, was mimicking its mother's behavior in a way that was strikingly deliberate. When the mother bear cautiously approached the tree line, the cub did the same. When she sniffed the air, the cub followed suit. And when she turned to look at Mark, the cub mirrored her. Its wide, inquisitive eyes watching him with curiosity rather than fear. Mark chuckled softly. It was learning. Not just how to survive, but also how to trust. A sign of gratitude. The weekly offerings of berries continued, and Mark, in turn, continued leaving small stones in their place, a silent exchange between man and bear. But one day, the pattern changed. Instead of berries, Mark found something else on the flat rock. A fish. A freshly caught fish, laid neatly in the same spot where the berries had always been placed. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This was different. This was no longer just a token of peace, it was an offering of sustenance. A gift. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket. She had hunted this fish. She had chosen to bring it here. And she had left it for him. Mark knelt beside the rock, staring at the fish in silent disbelief. It wasn't just about food. It was about connection. The mother bear, this wild, untamed creature, had acknowledged his role in their story. And in the only way she knew how, she had given him something in return. A bond had been formed. Not of ownership. Not of dominance. But of mutual understanding. A lesson for the world. As news of Mark's encounters spread through the ranger community, researchers and wildlife experts began taking interest in his story. Scientists had long debated the intelligence and emotional depth of wild animals, but this case was something new. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about instinct. It was about recognition, respect, even gratitude. Wildlife experts visited Mark's cabin, setting up observation points in hopes of understanding the mother bear's behavior. But even with all their knowledge, none of them could fully explain what had transpired between Mark and the bear. There were theories, of course. Perhaps she associated him with safety. Perhaps she had simply learned not to fear him. Or perhaps, just perhaps, there was something more to these creatures than anyone had ever realized. A deeper intelligence. A consciousness that extended beyond what science had ever measured. And as Mark sat on his porch one evening, watching the mother bear disappear into the woods with her now strong cub, he couldn't help but believe it. This was more than just survival. This was something far greater. This was trust. This was understanding. This was family. Epilogue: The Return. Years passed, and the mother bear's visits became less frequent. The cub, now fully grown, had ventured off on its own, forging its own path in the wilderness. But every now and then, on a quiet morning or a peaceful evening, Mark would look to the edge of the forest. And there she would be. Watching. Waiting. Acknowledging. And in those moments, Mark knew one thing for certain. Some bonds, no matter how unlikely, can never be broken. Years had passed since the day Mark first stepped into the muddy trap to save the tiny bear cub. Seasons changed, forests grew denser, and life in the wilderness continued its endless cycle. But some things, some rare, remarkable things, remained. And among them was the bond between man and bear. The changing of the seasons. Mark had spent countless sunrises and sunsets watching over the land he had come to love like a second home. The towering pines, the whispering streams, the crisp air that carried the scent of earth and rain, this wilderness had given him everything. And in return, he had given it something, too. Respect. Understanding. Trust. Though the mother bear's visits had become less frequent, he still saw her from time to time. She was older now, her once sleek fur bearing the wear of time. But she was still powerful. Still wise, still a guardian of the forest. Mark often wondered if she still remembered him the way he remembered her. And then, on a quiet autumn morning, he got his answer. The return of the next generation. Mark had just finished his morning patrol when he noticed movement at the tree line. At first, he assumed it was a deer or perhaps a lone wolf passing through. But then he saw her. The mother bear. And she wasn't alone. Beside her stood another bear, one that Mark recognized instantly. The cub he had once saved. No longer a tiny, mud-covered creature, but a strong, fully grown bear. Its dark fur gleamed in the golden morning light, its powerful stance mirroring its mother's. But what took Mark's breath away was what stood beside the young bear. Two small cubs. Her cub had become a mother. Mark's throat tightened as he watched them from a distance. The cycle had continued. The story had not ended with him. It had only just begun. A gesture that spoke volumes. What happened next was something Mark could never have anticipated. The mother bear, his old friend, turned to her grown cub and nudged it forward slightly. The younger bear hesitated for a moment before taking a few cautious steps toward Mark's cabin. It did not come too close, but it did not run either. Instead, it simply observed him, just as its mother once had. And then, in a moment that sent shivers down Mark's spine, the young bear did something remarkable. It lowered its head, just as its mother had done years before. A sign of respect. A silent acknowledgement. Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing deep into his heart. The bond had not been lost. It had been passed on. A story that touched the world. The news of this extraordinary encounter spread quickly. Wildlife researchers, journalists, and conservationists all wanted to understand what had happened in these woods. The idea that a wild bear could pass on a learned trust from one generation to the next was something almost unheard of. Could animals remember kindness? Could they teach it to their young? Mark had no doubt. The footage of the young bear's visit, captured by one of the research cameras near his cabin, went viral. People around the world were captivated by the idea that wild creatures could possess a depth of understanding far beyond what science had ever measured. Mark was invited to speak at conservation conferences, his story becoming a powerful symbol of coexistence between humans and wildlife. Schools used his tale to teach children about respect for nature. Documentaries were made. And yet, for all the attention his story received, Mark remained the same. He was still just a man who had once chosen to step into the mud and save a life. A choice that had changed everything. The final visit. Years passed, and Mark grew older, just as the mother bear had. He no longer patrolled the forest as often, but he still sat on his porch each morning, watching the tree line. Waiting. And one day, she came back. The mother bear, now moving slower, her fur showing the signs of age, appeared one last time. Mark didn't move. He simply watched. She stood at the edge of the forest, her dark eyes locking onto his. And then, just as she had done so many years ago, she bowed her head. A final goodbye. A silent thank you. And with that, she turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind a story that would never be forgotten. Mark sat there for a long time, the autumn wind rustling through the leaves. And for the first time in years, he whispered the words he had said the day he first met her. "You're not alone." And somewhere, in the heart of the wild, the legacy of trust lived on. The end. Or just the beginning. This story is a reminder that kindness can leave ripples far beyond what we see. If this tale moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the magic that still exists in our world. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of connection, courage, and compassion. Nature has an incredible way of teaching us about life, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living beings. This story of trust between a man and a bear reminds us that kindness is never forgotten. That even the wildest hearts can recognize compassion, and that one small act of bravery can echo across generations. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many other incredible moments are happening in the world right now, stories of animals defying the odds, humans forming unspoken connections with nature, and lessons that remind us of the beauty of coexistence. Join our journey into the extraordinary. Subscribe to my channel to hear more heartwarming, unbelievable, and inspiring true stories that will leave you in awe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Let's connect. Share your thoughts in the comments. What amazed you the most about this story? Have you ever experienced an incredible moment with an animal? Let's keep the conversation going and build a community of nature lovers, storytellers, and dreamers. Spread the magic. If this story inspired you, share it with a friend, family member, or anyone who could use a reminder that the world is full of wonder. Thank you for being here. Your support means the world, and together, we can celebrate the untold stories of nature, compassion, and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. You won't believe what's coming next. See you in the next video.